So in our previous video, we established an introduction to macroevolution, and I alluded to the fact that macroevolution is going to be highly devoted to that idea of speciation. And with that idea of speciation comes the idea of understanding what really is a species. And we know from Ernst Mayer's biological species concept that a species is something that has the potential to interbreed amongst itself to produce fertile and viable offspring. So we're actually going to work off of that idea of a species and start talking about differentiation, the idea of speciation developing as we see it in nature. And we're going to entitle the next couple of flowcharts Reproductive Isolation in order to really understand this concept of how a species turns into a species. So we're going to title this Reproductive Isolation, and we'll call it Reproductive Isolation, Roman numeral 1. So in this first flowchart, we're first going to, of course, define what reproductive isolation is. And we mentioned it briefly in our previous video, but now we want to put some really hardcore definitive terms to what reproductive isolation is all about. So let's look at this definition. Reproductive isolation is all about the mechanisms, okay, these are physical mechanisms, that are in there to actually prevent right now. We're trying to prevent a key event from happening. Mechanisms to prevent members of different species, so we'll say members of, and that's a key here, different species. So different species. Prevent members of a different species from doing what? Well, we want to reproductively isolate things. So we want to prevent things that are not within the same species from interbreeding. Okay? From interbreeding, from undergoing any sort of reproductive events. We want to isolate reproduction in a nutshell. And also we want to make sure that through this prevention of interbreeding, what have we also prevented? We've also prevented producing the classic offspring, right? But we want to make sure we prevent for the producing of viable and fertile offspring. Those two key words. Whenever you see offspring, you have to remember you want the offspring to be viable and fertile. But in this situation of reproductive isolation, we don't want it to be viable and fertile. We don't want interbreeding because why? Because we're looking at members of a different species. In essence, what we're trying to do is prevent gene flow. We're trying to prevent right now. We're not trying to encourage. We're trying to prevent gene flow. Meaning we're trying to prevent interbreeding, we're trying to prevent this mating event happening between two members of different species because there's going to be big problems that can happen if they do end up mating. And we're going to talk about those as we move forward. So we're trying to prevent gene flow, but we want to make sure we say that this is between other species, okay? If we look at our previous idea of speciation and the biological species concept, we were okay with gene flow so long as it was within a species. But we want to prevent it between other species. We want to make sure that gene flow does not happen between other species because there are going to be consequences of such a thing. And one of those consequences is something called a hybrid. And we actually want to prevent that. This idea of reproductive isolation actually prevents what we call hybrid formation, and this is a good thing. Okay, you might be thinking, okay, well, why don't we just try to have gene flow between other species? Why don't we just try to increase variation? These things are not that easy. Speciation is not that easy. It's an important event that occurs because of things like reproductive isolation, because we want to prevent hybrid formations. And we can simply consider a hybrid the following, and I'll quickly define it right underneath here so that we have an understanding. A hybrid can be simply defined as the offspring, okay, it's offspring, but it's specific to a key event. It's the offspring from what we call inter, that means between, specific. Inter, and what do you think specific means? Species, right? From interspecific mating. So two different species mating, if they do end up happening to produce an offspring, that offspring will be considered a hybrid. Think of a lion and a tiger producing a liger. This is something in nature that is not supposed to happen. This is a reproductive isolation event. We're going to see why as we look at the idea of reproductive isolation.